I think maybe the best place to start is the only subject about which every modal theorist agrees is that nobody agrees about modal theory. That's a trope that goes throughout every single music theory, modal theory treatise from the 16th through the 17th and 18th century, especially in the 17th and 18th century. And so my approach to that has been, instead of saying, okay, why even bother? Let's turn that around and look at the nature of those disagreements as the basis as the beginning of our investigation, to look through the wrong end of the telescope, you might say, to flip the problem around. So here are some of the problems we're dealing with. If we deal with Zarlino, basically, or Glorian, let's say Glorian's 12-mode system, where you've got 12 modes on 2 transposition levels, cantus durus and cantus mollis, and then you look at the Well-Tempered Clavier, 1723, and you have 2 modes now on 12 transposition levels. How did you get from one to the other? And the problem is that every single term in each of the different national traditions undergoes a shift in meaning. So the first problems are linguistic, because we're dealing with German, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English, French, some Flemish. Even I don't speak Russian, but there's Russian sources. So you've got a linguistic tradition, and then within those linguistic traditions, you have music theory traditions in the shift of meanings. Words like tuono or tonus have a shift in meaning. So that's one of the first problems. It's geographical scope, and it's chronological scope and linguistic scope. Another problem has to do with the musical pluralism of life, and of life in European culture, Western European culture specifically, between this period. So the number one influence on modal theory is religion. Like, that is the Catholic Protestant divide has a very big impact on transmission patterns and preferences within modal theory, as does the Anglican situation up north. So that's another reason for this divide. Another is that even if you go to a place like France or Italy that's religiously relatively homogenous or hegemonic religiously, you've got different performance practice traditions. So by the time that we get to the late 17th century, we have simultaneously 4 different modal systems that a musician needs to know, right? So, for example, take the situation, you've got everybody still singing plain chant, because everything once introduced continues. So we're still singing plain chant, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, and that, of course, is the 8-mode system beginning on mode 1, D authentic. Zarlino comes along, Glorian first, then Zarlino comes along and introduces a 12-mode system, which adds modes on A and C, 2 each on A and C. But after a while, Zarlino rethinks this in his Dimostrazioni Armoniche of 1571. He says, it'd make a lot more sense to renumber these starting on C. So now we have traditional mode 1 that begins on D, and new dodecachordal mode 1 that begins on C. And suddenly those 2 systems are no longer in synchronization. Now, another thing that's going on is that we have the Catholic renewal movement of the so-called Catholic Reformation or Counter-Reformation. And one of the things that this does is it means that psalm settings become far more ubiquitous in everyday life and in the lives of musicians than mass settings. In the earlier 16th century, it's more mass. But if you look at the statistics, as I've done in depth for the second book I'm working on, there's just so many more compositions written for the Psalms. And as your readers may or your listeners may or may not know, Psalm settings tend to follow different cadential hierarchies and have different divisions of the octave than the regular modes. So this eventually leads to a situation, starting with Banchieri, Zacconi, right around 1605, 1600, depending whether you're looking at the source, the music sources or the theory sources, where we have something called the church tones. The church tones are a set of 8 modal categories that are associated with polyphonic settings of the Psalms. And to be more specific, with the keyboard tonalities that are the keyboard keys that are used to accompany the most common tonalities used for the Psalms. So the church tones. The problem is the church tones don't make sense from a theoretical standpoint. They make absolute sense from a practical standpoint, but not from a theoretical standpoint. So Dahlhaus, for example, just dismisses them as nonsense. He doesn't understand what's driving them. So we've got those 3. We've got the 8-mode system, 2 different iterations of the 12-mode system. We've got the church tones. And this, by the early 17th century, this creates this crisis of complexity, especially in France. This is crucial. France. Why France? The French love order. And the French have this, at least in their music theory, they do. And they're really obsessed with scales having integrity. So they look at, they're very persuaded, the French theorists are very persuaded by the logic of Zarlino's renumbering. But now what this means is that the organist on the organ bench playing for a church service at the Saint-Chapelle or any church in France now has a problem. Is the tonality that is, we would call, let's say, A minor, or you could call it A plagal, what is that? Is that an a finalis ending of mode 1 in the traditional 8 modes? Is it mode 10, or is it the 3rd church tone? Right? It's super complex. Or is it, in fact, mode 11 in Zarlino, mode 11 or 12 in Zarlino's second ordering? So it creates a crisis of complexity. Wouldn't it just be easier to say, play it on A with a blank signature, or play it on A with a minor third? And that is why it is the French who lead the way. It's because of that crisis of complexity prompted by their adoption of Zarlino's second ordering. So they lead the way, first in very descriptive ways. So they'll say, yeah, it's mode 10, or it's mode, 1, or whatever the mode number is, or tone, mode or tone. But then they'll say A with a minor third. And that, at the very beginning, the major and minor keys are descriptive categories within other modal schemes. But by around 1680, that flips, and they start to say, no, major mode is its own scalar entity that can be transposed anywhere against the fixed keyboard. So that's that shift from a descriptive to a prescriptive model takes about 50 years, and it occurs above all in France. They're the drivers, but the whole picture is Western European. So we also have to look at the Spanish, Portuguese sources, the German sources, the northern sources. So it's a pretty rich phenomenon. I would say that the critical endpoints for my investigation, in the repertoire study, I go all the way up to 1800, but the really critical arrival points are Campion's Rule of the Octave and Heineken's treatise on harmony, which are both in the second decade, 1711, 1717. So those are critical points, which the French and the Germans each bring something different to this mix. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. You got 4 main systems: 8-mode system, 2 different versions of the 12-mode system, the church tones, which was the subject of my dissertation, and which is the main focus in practical terms of my second book, and then the major minor system. So that's why it's confusing, because there's this tremendous pluralism, and they're also associated with different repertoires. So to some extent, the 8 modes are very much plain chant. The 12 modes and church tones are about vocal polyphony. The 8 mode, or the 2-mode system, arises from the role of the keyboard, though it is not exclusive to keyboard music.